Hi, everybody. We're delighted to be back again, this time with a webinar, the next resource on our series, a part of the community call with Change X. So this webinar is with Professor Louise Gallagher, and it's on emotional regulation. This is something we've been getting a lot of queries about, a lot of people getting in touch saying either themselves as an autistic person or as a parent, they're finding that their child is finding it quite difficult to regulate themselves during this unprecedented time, where perhaps they're not getting the usual opportunities to regulate themselves in the way they would normally be comfortable with. So I'm going to hand you over to Louise Gallagher, and we're delighted to be able to link in with you and hear about your expertise and your experience, and hopefully everybody will benefit from that. So hi, Louise.
As I am, for inviting me to give this webinar on emotion regulation, behaviour and autism as part of the As I Am webinar series. During this webinar, I'm going to talk about emotions. I'm going to talk about emotion regulation. I'm going to talk about autism and emotion regulation. And I'm going to talk about some strategies and tips for helping your child to regulate emotionally. So first of all, what are emotions and why do we experience them? Well, although we talk about emotions all the time, they are a little bit hard to define. So emotions are defined as biological states that we experience both in our brain and our body. And these can influence our thinking and behavior. And emotions can really affect our ability to think clearly and critically. But they are really important because they help us to adapt to our environment, for example, to recognize threat, to promote social relationships and learning, or to communicate. And there are three key elements of emotion that I wanted to talk about because these are very important when it comes to emotion regulation. So subjectively, we might have an experience. It could be a good experience or a bad experience. And this can promote a feeling in our body, a physical or physiological response. This might be your heart beating quickly, sweating, tremoling, butterflies in your tummy. And that can be associated then with a behavioral response, which could be an emotional behavioral response, such as crying, getting angry, or running away. When we are young, we don't really have a great awareness of these, of the physical and behavioral responses associated with emotions, and we don't really recognize our emotions very well. But when we have young children, we encourage them to develop an awareness of their emotions by repeating their feelings and their experiences and matching them with emotions so that it builds this recognition. So for example, a parent might say to a child, "Oh, I see that Granny gave you a toy for your birthday. You really love it, don't you? Are you happy?" And that matches the language with the physical feeling and the thoughts that the child is having. And then over time, they start to develop better and more complex and nuanced understanding of their emotions. So for example, they might be able to say, "I have butterflies in my tummy," for example. But it does take time over the course of childhood and adolescence to really recognize how you're feeling. Now, how do autistic people experience emotions? Well, there can be barriers for autistic people in recognizing their emotions. So there are two concepts that researchers talk about. One is alexithymia, which literally means no words for feelings. And some autistic people find it difficult to recognize how they feel. And the other concept is alexithymia, which means lacking body awareness. And this means that this describes how some autistic people find it hard to locate an emotion in their body. So these two things coupled together can mean that autistic people can have reduced emotional awareness and reduced emotion regulation. So what is emotion regulation? Well, we all are capable of emotion regulation, both consciously and unconsciously. So emotion regulation is the ability that we have to stop ourselves reacting in an impulsive or inappropriate way in response to strong negative or positive emotions, to manage ourselves, to pursue our goals, independent of the emotional response we feel, to cope with those negative feelings of strong emotion, and to refocus attention in the presence of strong emotion. So, for example, if you were to witness a serious accident, for example, you might be very shocked and traumatized, but you might find that unconsciously you click in to think, what do I need to do? Check the person's okay, call the emergency services. And afterwards, you might recognize that you feel very upset, and you might check in with yourself and say, but I feel okay and I did the right thing. So you reassure yourself. So that's an example of both conscious and unconscious emotion regulation at play. Now, emotion regulation can have a real relationship with coping and mental health. And the ways that we cope with our emotion regulation can be adaptive or maladaptive. Maladaptive coping strategies mean where we might allow our emotions to take over. So we might get angry very easily, cry, or we may engage in maladaptive behaviors like drinking too much alcohol or eating too much, for example. And we know that these maladaptive behaviors can be linked to anxiety, depression, and certain personality types. Adaptive responses to emotion regulation is where we're able to take perspective on things, recognize perhaps unhealthy emotions, and take steps to help ourselves. So, for example, if you're very busy at work and you realize that you have too much to do and you're feeling very anxious and perhaps not sleeping, you may recognize that in yourself, and you may say to yourself, well, I need to talk to my boss or my co-worker and see, can they help me with some of this work or reduce some of the workload that I have? And that can be an adaptive way to reduce your anxiety. So why then is emotion regulation more challenging for autistic people? Well, we already talked about the concept of alexithymia and alexithymia, and so we know that autistic people might have reduced mental and body awareness of the emotions that they're feeling, but they also may not have quite as well developed language and emotion competence. So they may have less language for emotions. They also may have difficulty taking perspective. So they may not see the other point of view, which means that if they're in a difficult situation, it's very hard for them to think about a different explanation for the situation. And from a social perspective, they may not always interpret the social context correctly. So, for example, they may find it harder to interpret people's social intentions. They may struggle more socially. And this may lead, for example, to greater social anxiety. Cognitively, some autistic people may think in a more rigid way. So again, this it sort of gets in the way of coming up with flexible solutions. And some autistic people are more impulsive, and therefore they're more inclined to react first and think later. And so even when they do have good coping strategies, they may not use them in the heat of the moment. And finally, and very importantly, is the whole issue of arousal and stress. That sensory sensitivities and difficulties with change and unpredictability and anxiety can increase arousal and stress and can lead to greater experience of emotion and greater challenges to regulate emotionally. So I just wanted, before I go in to talk about emotion regulation in more detail, I wanted to also differentiate the difference between stress and distress, because I think it could be helpful for us to understand how some autistic people are feeling in certain situations. So stress can be what we call adaptive. It can be quite helpful in certain situations to help motivate or focus you. So, and it can, particularly when it's short term, so it can improve performance. For example, we might feel mildly stressed going into an exam or public speaking, for example, but it can improve your performance. It's understood as something that we can handle. But when we have long-term stress or we're in a state of distress is when we have anxiety. It can cause unpleasant feelings in our body. It can increase our blood pressure. It can cause mental health difficulties, and it's understood to be something that we can't handle. And we are beginning to think that some autistic people, because their tolerance of sensory overload in their environment or their difficulties with change, might make them feel in that more sort of distress state some of the time. So if you can imagine what that feels, because we've all felt distress some of the time, this might be the way an autistic person is feeling, even although you don't necessarily recognize the things in the environment that have caused them to feel this way. So even minor things sometimes can make them feel quite distressed. I think a special note has to go also to the role that sensory sensitivities can play in stress. So we know that many autistic people have, I suppose, different sensory experiences from typically developing people, in the sense that certain kinds of sensory inputs can be, they can be very sensitive to them, such as lights or noises or smells. And then when we couple that with the fact that they may not be recognizing how they're feeling inside, this can increase anxiety and reduce their coping and response to stress. So what kinds of emotion regulation challenges, therefore, are common in autism? Well, many of you will probably recognize that if your child or young person is frustrated, they might be more likely to react really negatively compared maybe with a typically developing child in the family. They may also be more likely to stay upset for a little bit longer, or they might default more quickly to more maladaptive strategies, for example, avoiding things that they don't like, denial, ruminating a lot or thinking over and over again about things, or emotional numbing, where they just kind of shut down emotionally. And they're less inclined to use adaptive strategies. And some researchers have suggested that this may be linked to the reason why there are increases in anxiety or depression or aggression or self-injurious behavior in the context of autism. So one other thing I thought would be really important to differentiate is between tantrums and autism-related behavior outbursts, because we're all very familiar with the terrible twos. So this developmental stage that really goes on for about 3 years, between 12 months and 4 years. And it's usually frustration related. So it's often when a child wants to do something that they can't, or they want something that the parent doesn't want them to have. And tantrums typically are quite strategic. So kids often will use them to get what they want. And they tend to persist when you pay attention to them, but they decrease when they're ignored. And we know that when parents give in to tantrums, that children will use the strategy again the next time that they want something. Now, we have to recognize that for some autistic children, if they are developmentally delayed, tantrums may continue for a longer period than, say, up to 4 years. So if you have a 5 or a 6-year-old who's still engaging in tantrums, that may not be unusual or abnormal for your child, because they may be, developing at a slightly different rate to typically developing children. However, I wanted to differentiate the tantrum from the outbursts that can occur in autism that might be more to do with sensory overstimulation or uncertainty. And these kinds of outbursts can sometimes continue until the child is reassured by a parent, or until they're completely exhausted. So, first of all, we need to understand what might be promoting a lack of emotion regulation in a child. So very often I get referred children who are aggressive, for example, or they're self-injuring, to ask, have they got some kind of psychiatric a problem, or do they need medication to help them regulate? And I might ask a lot of questions about aggression, or when the aggression arises and what causes it and what's the trigger for it. But actually, while I was, thinking about this subject for the webinar, I was thinking that it's a much more effective way to think about emotion regulation, is looking at how a child regulates themselves emotionally and tolerates frustration, because it can help us to identify strategies that the child might use or that we can build on. So we might want to look at How do they tolerate frustration? Is it age appropriate? Is this just a tantrum, or is it something more than that? How emotionally competent is the child? So how aware are they of other people's emotional states? Can they connect with them? Can they describe their own emotional feelings? And can they maybe differentiate between similar but distinct emotions, or do they mix them up? So Mrs. Byrne wasn't frowning at you when she went into her house. She was just squinting because the light was really bright, for example. So we also have to ask ourselves, how could autism affect emotion regulation? So this could be to do with, how the child communicates emotions verbally, or how they can interact socially. And then critically, what kinds of regulatory strategies does your child use? Are they maladaptive? Are they aggressing verbally or physically? Are they self-injuring? Or are they adaptive? Are they able to use any strategies such as self-soothing? Or can you distract your child? Or does exercise help them? So what strategies do we use? So I'm going to go through these strategies in a little bit more detail. And many of these strategies will be very familiar to you as regular autism strategies that you've probably been recommended and probably are using. But I thought in the current time, when you're a little bit more cut off from the supports and services, that it might be good just to go over some of these again. And then I was going to talk about some strategies that are more directed towards building coping skills. So we're going to touch on building routine and structure, quiet time, visual strategies, a little bit about functional behavior analysis, building emotional awareness. And then I also just want to mention, before I start talking about these strategies, that some of you might be experiencing that some of these outbursts are not happening in younger children, but they're happening in older adolescents or young adults. And this is a very vulnerable period of development for a number of different reasons. So all teenagers are a little bit more vulnerable to mental health difficulties and a bit more emotionally reactive. They're also going through periods of changes hormonally and in their brain. And of course, if you're autistic, you might be experiencing far greater social challenges than the average teenager. So these can be periods when you might see a big increase in difficulty with emotion regulation. And although some of the strategies that I'll be talking about might seem like they're suited for younger children, I think with some adaptation, they can be also useful for older teenagers and young adults. So just to start with the visual supports then. So many of you probably use these already, but what these are helpful for is to build a sense of predictability into the day. So researchers are increasingly acknowledging that unpredictability is something that is very difficult for autistic children, adolescents, and adults. And that they're very intolerant of uncertainty in their environment. So, for example, a visual schedule such as this might help create a routine or a structure, and that might be particularly useful right now when the normal routines of going to school have disappeared. For some children, they may want to just do the enjoyable activities, and they may not want to do other chores that they need to do. Now, I don't know if everybody is still trying to do schoolwork, or, for some families, you may just have to abandon schoolwork at this stage, but you still might want your child to do things during the day that your child is less interested in doing, like taking a shower or brushing their teeth. So the first and then boards, for example, can be useful then, just to promote an understanding that, that you can have the enjoyable thing, but first you need to do you need to do some of the things that you have to get done in the day that are maybe not so enjoyable. Visual supports for children to transition between activities, if transitioning is a real problem, can be helpful. So for some children, using the egg timer can be really helpful to signal the end of one activity and moving on to another activity. Of course, I know for some children this can be a bit of a trigger too, that they don't like to see the egg timer come to the end. And social stories can be really helpful for a number of different, for lots, I mean, how many different scenarios have we got social stories? The example here is where we use the social story also to create another strategy for dealing with anger. So for example, this social story says, when I get angry, I hit mommy, but it makes her sad. So when I get angry, when I feel like hitting somebody, I need to stop. I need to hold my hands, take 5 big breaths. It helps me to stay calm, and mummy's happy when I'm calm. And I'm going to come back to some of these strategies because although they seem really simple, there's a lot of basis in neuroscience for just using deep breathing to help us calm and regulate ourselves. So another visual aid that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with is the incredible 5-point scale. And the incredible 5-point scale is just basically like, or a feelings thermometer, some people might call it, but it's a scale that goes from 1 to 5, and it reflects different states of emotion dysregulation, if you like. So a 1, for example, is I can handle this, whereas a 5 is this can make me lose control. And the incredible 5-point scale has 2 obvious excellent uses. One is it can be used to build a child's awareness of emotion and what triggers it. And the second is to develop the parent, caregiver, or teacher's understanding of what are the triggers. So when using the incredible 5-point scale to build awareness, for example, a parent or a teacher can expose a child, maybe using cards or verbally, to different scenarios and ask the child, how does that make you feel? And the child can match the activity onto a number on the scale. So for example, a parent can have a card deck with different scenarios like going shopping or going to the restaurant or going to the cinema. And the child can put these into different pockets corresponding to the numbers. And it helps the child to match the feeling with a number or indeed a color. As you can see, there are different colors on the scale as well. And if they have difficulty describing the emotion, sometimes a number or a color can be more useful for an autistic child. But by engaging in that activity, it builds the child's awareness, but also the parent begins to understand. So, going shopping, number 3, can make them feel nervous. So you can begin to anticipate things that are going to make the child feel a little more dysregulated. The next thing I wanted to talk about in managing emotion regulation is managing sensory overstimulation. Now, a lot of the work around sensory overstimulation has been done by occupational therapists in terms of developing the idea of sensory processing. And occupational therapists often talk about the 7 sensory systems, and these are usually occupational therapists who are trained in sensory integration therapy. When we think of our senses, we think of 5 senses. So we think of taste, touch, smell, vision, and hearing. But the occupational therapists also add in the sense of proprioception, which is an awareness of your body, and the vestibular sense, which is an awareness of body movement. And they use these, it is proposed by occupational therapists and sensory integration therapists that some children really crave certain types of sensory input, and they find other types of sensory input quite aversive. And an occupational therapist will often evaluate that in a child by doing a sensory evaluation and recognize the sensory sensitivities, and they may help your child to use different kinds of sensory inputs to help themselves regulate from a sensory perspective. Sometimes this is called a sensory diet. Now, there haven't been a huge number of clinical studies of this kind of approach, and it is very individual, so it can be very much trial and error in terms of finding maybe different sensory strategies that help your child to regulate. But some children it works very well for, in my experience. And some of the ways that you can use sensory stimulation or sensory strategies can be to take care of yourself if you're likely to become overloaded from a sensory perspective. So, for example, if you're in an environment that's noisy, you can use noise cancelling headphones. If the child's on a bus going under normal circumstances going to school, and another child is screeching, the headphones can be really helpful. Using weighted blankets or vests is another strategy, and OT device that can be very helpful for some children. But again, I would do this with the help of an occupational therapist. So if you have an awareness of your child's sensory needs, you can use some of these strategies during this time, perhaps to help them regulate a little bit better. Finally, then, I just wanted to talk about chilling out and developing coping skills. So I'm going to start with the chilling out idea first, because I think when we try to create routine and structure for our children, we have to remember that it's also really important that there's downtime. We all need downtime, and autistic children need it too. So having a space in the home where a child can go to engage in activities that they enjoy, if it's their repetitive behaviours or sensory activities, can be a good way to let them just decompress a little bit if there have been a lot of demands on them during the day. And it doesn't have to be something really expensive like these really fancy sensory pods that I've seen. It can just simply be a quiet space in the house or in the bedroom where you've got some of the things, objects that the child or the young person likes. Now, what I would recommend about the chilling out spaces is that they don't necessarily become entirely linked to gaming, particularly for adolescents, because gaming, while it's relaxing, too much gaming is going to lead kids to sit around a lot and not engage in physical activity, and then they'll miss the exercise component of sensory, of regulating themselves. And some of the games can be very stimulating. So again, it's a little bit like us being on our computers all day trying to meet deadlines for work, and you feel very agitated by the end of it. So I think that having space to chill needs to also be separate from space to do things like gaming or spending a lot of time on computers. And then I'm going to talk about the coping skills that maybe children need to be taught and modelled so that they can cope with their emotion dysregulation. So first of all, we need to recognise when our child is getting dysregulated. So we might notice this about their physical presence, emotionally, behaviourally, or in terms of their thinking. So from a physical point of view, do they seem tense or restless? Are they sweating? Are they complaining of tummy aches or headaches, or has their sleep changed? Emotionally, are they feeling very fearful, jumpy, tearful, or irritable? Behaviourally, do they avoid places or people, or are they looking for more reassurance? Have they become more rigid? Are they scripting more than usual? And in terms of their thinking, do they seem more worried than usual? Are they on high alert, or has their attention or concentration disimproved? And really knowing when your child is becoming dysregulated and being able to recognize that can help you prevent the meltdowns from happening, because it can help you then to intervene with the strategies that they need. One of the strategies that we talk about is co-regulation. So this is the idea that we learn a lot of children in particular can learn a lot of skills in their social environment and in their relationships within their families and their caregiver relationships. Co-regulation is a process where one person's emotional state can influence another. So I think we're all familiar with that. We might notice if our partner's not had a good day, how that might make us feel. And similarly, children learn their coping strategies from observation. So parent coping styles are really, really influential to support children to develop good coping styles. So when your child is becoming emotionally dysregulated, I'm going to talk about the 5 steps that we probably need to take just to help them develop good coping skills. So, and these 5 steps are staying calm, acknowledging their feelings, gathering information, reflecting it back, and then looking for solutions. So in terms of staying calm and neutral, so children will pick up if you're not calm. And when you feel calm, they will feel things are a little more under control. So first thing you need to do is check in with yourself. How am I feeling? Maybe take a breath. A deep, slow breath in and out will help you just to calm yourself a little bit. Lower your voice and use a calm and kind but firm voice, but limit what you say, because talking too much when children are becoming dysregulated, number one, they won't hear you, and number two, they may become more dysregulated because they'll be too overloaded. And avoid physical contact, so don't go into their physical space. So you can then acknowledge how the child is feeling. So for some children, you'll be able to say, I can see that you're feeling angry. I can see that you're feeling sad right now. For other children, it might be better to use the feelings thermometer. I can see that you look like you're number 5 at the feelings thermometer right now. What do you think you need to do? And then if the child has calming strategies, you can encourage them to use them. So if the noise is bothering you, put on your headphones. If you're feeling like you're going to explode, maybe take a deep breath. Maybe go outside, kick a football. So again, it's just trying to redirect the child or distract them, but at the same time acknowledge their feelings. Because the message we want the child to have is, it's okay to feel like that. It's just we don't want them to engage in the maladaptive behavior. We want them to use the adaptive behavior. When things are calm, you can gather information. So it can be helpful to ask the child, what made them feel upset? Or did you notice anything that made your, did you notice anything yourself that might have been a trigger for your child becoming upset? And sometimes when things get more extreme, you can get help from a professional like a psychologist who will want to look at what we call the ABCs of behavior. So the antecedents, the behaviors, and the consequences. And this is kind of the functional behavior and analysis that a trained psychologist might do to come up with a behavior plan for your child. But gathering information can still be helpful for you in the current circumstances to help you understand what is more inclined to make your child feel dysregulated, and what way can you structure their day maybe to reduce some of that distress. The other thing that we all need when we get upset is for people to reflect back on how we're feeling. So you can say back to your child when you say to your child, what was it that upset you? And they say, I want the computer. I can see you're upset because you can't go on the computer right now. Now, some children won't be able to say that. So you can say, well, I noticed that you're looking worried or sad right now. And that might be all that they need to reflect back on it. And then finally, you want to look for the solutions, because this is really where your child learns some new skills. So you might say to the child, I see when you were annoyed when you had to stop using the computer. What else could you have done? And if your child says, no matter what they say, whatever their suggestion is, it's good to accept and praise the child for coming up with the solution to validate their idea. That's a really good suggestion. But you might also want to suggest something. So I have an idea. Would you like to hear it? And maybe you can negotiate with each other to come up with an idea. And maybe that goes into the social story then that you develop with the child. So, the next time you ask me to stop using the computer, I'm not going to throw my iPad on the ground. I might be annoyed. I might hold my hands and count to 5 and take a deep breath or whatever. But it's really important that you've started to build some of those coping skills with your child before you get them to use these skills in a situation where they are really stressed and over aroused, because they're not going to be able to use them if they haven't practiced them. Now, many people will say, well, I'm in lockdown, so what am I going to do if my child has a full-blown tantrum or a meltdown? So first of all, I think it's important to decide, well, what is it that your child is having? Is it a tantrum? Is it a meltdown? As we said already, a tantrum should go away if it's ignored. If it's a meltdown, you might need to use other strategies. So First of all, if it's a meltdown and your child is overstimulated, decrease stimulation. Turn down the lights, turn down any sounds, perhaps calmly ask other children to leave the room if they're there. Make the child remain calm and make them feel like you're in control. And this is true for an adolescent or an adult as well. This is called de-escalation. Don't make demands. So don't talk to them, don't shout over them. Silence sometimes can be useful, and respect their personal space. So stay back from them. If it's a young child, you might need to get down to their level to speak with them. And if they're verbally aggressive, for example, you don't need, if they say, I'm sad, you can acknowledge, yes, I see you're sad. But if they're verbally aggressive, saying, you're a terrible mother or father, don't respond to that. Just ignore that. Let that go. The other thing that you might need to do is have a safety plan for physical aggression with somebody else in your family, and if you're attending services, with the services. So if there's, if it's likely that your child is inclined to aggress physically, make sure that you have help at hand, make sure that you can secure the safety of other people, and make sure that anything that could be used as a weapon or an object is removed from the environment. Because sometimes children can react very impulsively and they can reach out for objects to hurt themselves or to hurt other people very impulsively when they're in a bit of a blind fury. Now, when the whole thing has settled, I really think the important thing is to be non-judgmental, because one thing I've learned from working with children who can become aggressive is that they actually, most autistic children will feel really bad about it afterwards. They'll feel very embarrassed and ashamed of their behavior. And I think really it's not about apportioning blame at that point. It's really about encouraging your child to think about what they could do differently in the future. So when things have calmed down, it's going back to that conversation where you're gathering information, saying, what made you feel this way? What else could you have done, do you think? What could mummy do to help you in the situation? What can we do to support you when you're feeling that way? But really trying to be non-judgmental, I think, can be very powerful and build the relationship between you and your child as opposed to complicating it. So that was more or less everything that I wanted to say. I think that, I am a researcher as well as a clinician, so I'm very interested in some new research in emotion regulation therapies. So we know that in typically developing youths and adults, cognitive behavior therapy and mindfulness therapies are effective, particularly for emotion regulation difficulties in the context of depression or anxiety or alcohol misuse. And CBT has been adapted successfully in autism for treating specific problems like anxiety. But there are mindfulness-based approaches which are really based on using calming strategies and connecting with the moment to support autistic people in relation to depression. And two programs are also undergoing evaluation at the moment for emotion regulation. So we'll await the results of those studies to see if these are strategies that could be introduced kind of therapeutically to support autistic people with their emotion regulation. Finally, I think it's really important to say that you have to take care of yourself. You have to remember that to be kind to yourself. You don't have to be a superhero in the business of parenting. All that's required of us is to be good enough parents. We don't have to be perfect. So remember that you can't care for another person if you don't care for yourself. So check in with yourself. How are you feeling? Manage your stress. This might be through taking exercise, practicing mindfulness or meditation, engaging in healthy behaviors, coping behaviors, socialize if you can. Now, I know that's hard at the moment, but even if it's a matter of having a Skype call or a FaceTime call with a friend over coffee for 20 minutes, having the opportunity just to tell another person how you feel who can empathize with you, we know is really, really supportive for people. limit things that might have a negative impact on your mood. So limit alcohol consumption and limit news consumption. This is something that I feel very strongly about, probably because of my own inclination to scroll mindlessly on news headlines at times. And if you can, I know it's not always possible for parents of autistic children, try to get some sleep. We can really, really cope better when we get a good night's sleep. Most importantly, ask for help. Friends, family, and services are there, and join a support group. So that's really it, I suppose. So just to sum up, I think emotions are a normal part of life, and we all have to learn how to manage our emotions appropriately. And this is what emotion regulation is, but it can be impacted by autism. And there are key strategies, many of them very basic strategies that we already know that support and prevent emotion regulation difficulties in autism. But autistic people also need to learn from others how to cope and regulate themselves. And if they can develop these skills over time, it will help them to function better and hopefully improve their quality of life. But parents are really important in this process, and they also need to look after themselves too. So thank you for listening. I hope that this was helpful in some way. And I'd also really like to acknowledge the help that I got from Mr. Parity Chizzy, who's an occupational therapist, and the Beach Park Autism Services Southside team for their help in preparing the slides. So many of the good ideas and suggestions came from a course that they ran for parents in emotion regulation. And I really appreciate them sharing some of these ideas with me. So Fiona, back over to you.
Thanks so much for that, Louise. That was all really helpful. I did mention at the start that we've had quite a few questions submitted to us. So I put those into a PowerPoint. If you're able to stop sharing your screen there, I can start sharing mine. We can go through some of those questions. There we go. And I'll just bring my screen up here. Just 1 second. Okay. So most of the questions were quite long, and I imagine a lot of these situations are quite complex for parents, and that would be the reason that there's a lot of detail involved. But the first question we got here, my son is 7 in September, and he still has huge temper tantrums when things don't go his way, even when given plenty of notice. Also, when he's playing with other children or his brother, he'll get frustrated and start screaming. He has had so much private therapy in this regard for years, but all the methods being taught he just can't do once a problem happens. We get down to his level and hug him and remind him to take deep breaths, squeeze his hands, rub his legs, etc. But it doesn't work. The school are finding this very hard, and he's starting to lose friends because of it. He goes from being so happy, and then the smallest thing can happen and the world is ending. We say and use the terms, is this a small, medium, or large problem? But everything is a huge problem, he says. We have done problem solving, and in practice he's excellent at it, but just can't do it once the problem happens. So have you any advice for this parent, Louise?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, just having sort of this information, I can only give general advice really, but I think there's a couple of things that pop out. So it seems to me like this child might have good verbal skills, but he may not be quite as competent emotionally. So we spoke about that before, the fact that some autistic children may struggle more with their emotional competence. And it sounds that frustration tolerance is a really big deal for this child. And I wonder also if part of the issue might be that if his language and emotion competence isn't the same as other children's, that he might be getting more frustrated in that context in terms of trying to, young children, the way they play, they negotiate, they fight, and he may not have the same competence, the same social competence to deal with those situations, and he might be getting quite overwhelmed. So that might be one area to look at. He might be 7 age-wise and verbally, but from an emotional and social point of view, he may actually be a little younger than that, and so he might be quite challenged in that social environment. I wondered also, was that impacting on him in the school environment? Because again, if he was in mainstream school, he could be more challenged from a social perspective. And I think that one of the difficulties is that when children begin to engage in behaviors like this, sometimes it can alienate them from other children, and then they start to feel, it starts to impact on how they feel about themselves. So I would definitely just look at how he is supported and coping in the school environment. I think the other thing is that it seems like when he's calm, he can talk through the problem solving, but this child is really not managing so well in the heat of the moment. So it could be that he's got a lot of impulsivity. And again, that could be something that a professional could help with by looking at, whether or not impulsivity and frustration tolerance are the things that are getting in the way, and building his ability to use kind of self-regulation strategies. So I see that the family are using one strategy with them, but I also wonder a little bit about some skill development in terms of his own coping skills, just to maybe be able to walk away from a situation, or to have another way to express his frustration when he's feeling very, very overwhelmed.
Great, thanks so much for that. So we'll move on to the next question. This one is about a 13-year-old girl who's autistic, has a moderate learning disability, and she has epilepsy also. Usually she's very well regulated and a happy girl when her routines are in place. Occasionally she has an off day, but don't we all? Right now she is missing school and her routines are completely gone. She's not dealing with these changes very well at all. She is shouting, spitting, and showing other challenging behaviours. She is not responding to homeschooling. She is not getting any online schooling, and I'm pretty sure she would not be a good candidate for this kind of learning. We have an occasional call with her teacher and with some of her class friends. We are a split family for some years now, and this is happening in both homes. Week on week in this crisis, the upset at home seems to be getting more frequent and more difficult for her, and therefore for parents. We're struggling to do more than be kind, patient, and to be calming.
So first of all, I thought that being kind, patient, and calming is exactly the right thing to do. So they're certainly starting from a very good point, but I can see that for this girl, she's really struggling with the changes that are going on at the moment. And I mean, as are we all. I mean, who hasn't hit a bit of a wall in the last 2 weeks with the tedium of lockdown, and doing the same thing day in, day out? And it may also be that, this girl is really missing the activities that she does in school. Perhaps she gets to go to swimming in school, or to horse riding, or to do other activities that she really enjoys. And perhaps in her own way, she's really missing her friends in school, or her teacher. And she's probably certainly missing the structure and the routine. So I thought that this was one, to again maybe revisit, the routine, a new routine at home, maybe a visual schedule for her up on the wall, just to illustrate what's happening on a daily basis. But given that, I thought maybe boredom might be a factor. I thought, maybe now that some of the restrictions are beginning to lift a little bit, that perhaps a little bit of novelty could be built into the day, perhaps some new trips to new places. And that on the As I Am website, you can also download the letter, which a service provider could sign for you, to allow you perhaps go slightly further afield. If you've been staying really close to home, because trying to find new things within a 2 or a 5 kilometre radius of your house can get pretty challenging. But, so perhaps if she might enjoy something novel, like going to the beach, or going to a particular park, or maybe gradually getting an ice cream as shops open up, those kinds of treats could be good in the week, and built into a visual schedule, they might help her a little bit more. The other thing is maybe a social story to reassure her that she is going to see her school and her classmates again, maybe with their photos, just to remind her that, that's, it's not forever. And I think then the other thing for this girl is probably exercise, so lots and lots of exercise. So getting her out to walk if possible, and good sleep if possible, because she's got epilepsy. So getting good sleep is really important. So the exercise will help the sleep as well.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Louise. Okay, the next question, I think this is one that many parents are probably experiencing at the moment. I know I am. How do I try to get the balance right between motivation and pressure in relation to schoolwork, and doing things other than, for example, playing on the computer all day? To explain, for example, I know that playing on the computer is a way of regulating and controlling the environment, but how much of this should we allow, and how much should other maybe non-favoured activities be encouraged, or should we just not encourage or push at all?
Yeah, I was thinking about this one. I mean, I think, first of all, I think there's a really good question in this. So how much of this should we allow? So now, this parent hasn't said how old their child is, but one of the things that I feel very strongly about, I can't always say that I always encourage this in my own children, but or that I was able to control it always in my own children. But I do think that too much time on the computer ultimately is dysregulating, for the reasons I mentioned during the talk. You're sitting there, you're getting depending on the games you're playing, you're getting very excited and wound up, and you're sitting, you're not moving around. So we all need exercise, I would say. So I would definitely try to limit computer use. And use it as a bit of a reward, really, for for getting other things done. So I thought it was a good example for a visual schedule. So maybe to schedule in time for computer and time for other things. And perhaps the computer can be a motivator for the other tasks that are less motivating. And now the parent here asks, well, what about schoolwork? Do we need to keep doing this, or should we give up on it? I mean, I think if you're struggling with schoolwork, certainly many of the parents that I've been talking to through the clinic have been talking to the teachers and saying, look, you're given too much homework or whatever, or it's just not getting done. I think you need to just revisit that with the teacher if the child is not motivated to do it, and look at things that the child could be more motivated to do. Of course, we all want children to be still engaging with education in some way, but we're not parents, we're not teachers, so it's very hard to really recreate that at home. But so maybe get certain things done, maybe ask for more enjoyable activities for the child, maybe make those outside the house, if it's a project on science, maybe go to the park or whatever, and do those. Don't do them at a desk, do them outside the house. But then you could also schedule other things in the day that the child needs to do depending on their developmental stage. It could be helping to stack the dishwasher, or it could be brushing teeth, or just having a shower, or getting dressed. Put them all in the visual schedule and allow the child to build up some time on the computer that they can use at different times of the day, but making it really clear that you need to probably come off the computer as well. You can't be on it all day, because none of us stay on the computer all day, because we know it's not healthy for us. So I thought a visual schedule and maybe even a social story might help the child to understand that you don't get the computer all day, because it's not actually healthy for you to sit at a computer all day. You need to do other things too.
Yeah, and we actually did a webinar with SuperValue a couple of weeks ago with Angela O'Connor, who's a special education teacher, and it was all about education in the home and how you can be doing fun things to get the same learning outcomes as you'd be achieving through academics and schoolwork. But it's in less of a pressured way, and it's more relationship focused. It's the parent and the child doing things together, and that the child is still ultimately learning from, but not having to sit down and do schoolwork. So perhaps if people haven't seen that, and this is an issue that they're finding, that could be helpful for them to get some tips and strategies on what they could be doing.
Sounds good.
So next question, my 4-year-old has started showing aggression towards my husband out of nowhere and for what appears to be no reason. He will punch, slap, or jump on him with force any chance he gets. He always does horseplay with him, and still does, as he enjoys rough and tumble play.
So now, I don't know from this example at what stage developmentally this child is at, but to me, this is an example of a young child getting emotionally dysregulated. So he's playing probably the horseplay. He's probably loving that with his dad, and lots of little boys loved horseplay with their dad. Lots of little boys and little girls love horseplay with their parents, but it's often with their dad. And I would say this child is just getting a bit overexcited during the horseplay. And I think that, you know, his impulse control is going and he's lashing out and he's getting very excited. So I thought that this would be a good one for a social story. You know, I thought that maybe this is something where, you know, they could have a story that says, you know, I love my dad, we love to play together, we like to roll around on the bed, we like to, you know, jump up and down in the garden or whatever it is. Sometimes I get really excited and I hit my dad, but that makes him sad. So maybe I need to think of something
Yeah.
when I'm really excited. Maybe I could punch a punch bag or something like that, you know, and we could punch a punch bag together or something, you know. So anyway, I'm just throwing out wild examples there, but I'm sure this family could come up with something that suited their context better. But to me, this just sounds like impulse control. He's getting overexcited. He's very young. He could be even younger than 4 developmentally, and he's just losing the run of himself. So I think it's about boundarying the behavior and giving him other alternatives.
Okay, brilliant. And I think we have another question. Yep. My 9-year-old daughter is struggling badly the last few weeks with emotional regulation, and it's even affecting her sleep now. She's starting to withdraw again and is regressing in terms of schoolwork after coming so far. And I think we did just touch on these kind of topics as well, but if you have any advice perhaps you could give this parent?
So, well, you know what, actually, I kind of picked up in this particular vignette is that perhaps this parent is quite anxious about schoolwork for the child, because that last sentence, she's starting to withdraw again, is regressing in terms of schoolwork after coming so far. I think, you know, don't put yourself under pressure about your child losing a little bit on the education front during this time, because I can tell you all the children in Ireland, or all the children all over the world, are losing a bit educationally at the minute. Okay, now hopefully they're gaining other things in terms of being with family and spending more time with people that they love. But you know, so first of all, just take a little bit of pressure off yourself around that. Maybe go back to that the webinar that you mentioned. That sounds like it's really good, and there are lots of good suggestions there. About the emotion regulation and the sleep, I would have a couple of questions for this parent. Obviously, I don't know the cognitive ability or the language use in the child, so I don't know if the child is able to talk about how they're feeling. I suppose it's just understanding what her sensory needs are and how she's regulating herself. Is she missing anything in the last few weeks since she's been at home more? Are there strategies that she normally uses that can be reintroduced? Does she need more or less structure or routine at the moment? And how much exercise? I always think when sleep's going off, exercise. I know always saying exercise, but I just really have so much faith in the value of it in terms of well-being for everybody. So making sure she's moving enough and getting out for a good walk every day, or some kind of physical activity every day, I think would be really helpful. Certainly, even, you know, if her mobility isn't great, even getting out in the sunshine and into nature can be helpful with that whole regulation as well.
Great. Now, I'm not sure if that was the last question. It was indeed. So I'll just stop sharing my screen. Okay, thanks so much for that. That was really, really helpful and really insightful. I think we gained quite a lot from that. I know I did, even just in terms of tips and strategies. But even for those parents who submitted questions, there were some really good tips, and even putting it back onto the parents to have a think a little bit deeper about, well, is this happening? Is that happening? And you know your child. Obviously, we can't give very specific answers for those questions. But just those general tips and strategies, I think, will be really helpful. So thank you so much, Louise.
Yeah.
We really, really appreciate it.
Not at all, Fiona. And I just want to remind parents, if they're linked with services and they've a lot of problems or worries or concerns, ring your service provider, okay? Because they are going to try to help you, to get to see you if they really need to. You know, we are in services now beginning to think of how can we see people, you know, who are maybe in more, maybe distressed. So reach out, ask for help. That's the important thing as well. Don't sit at home with a problem. If you can, ask someone for help.
Absolutely. Those are really good words to end on, I think, just to remind people that there is support there for them, and just to reach out for it, and don't be worried that you're bothering anybody, because we're all in this together, and we need to take what support is available to us. So thank you so much, Louise. I will let you go now. We really appreciate it, and hopefully we'll link in again soon.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Fiona. And
No
thanks
problem.
for inviting me to do it. I hope it was helpful.
Thank you so much.
Great. Bye.